I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all.
and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay. At this time, I will open the floor up for public comments. So those of you that are attendees to the meeting this evening, if you could please use our normal procedure, which would be if you could raise your hand. Devin will go ahead and unmute you. As soon as that happens, you'll be able to speak, but please remember to state your name and address for the record for us, please. Okay, one more offer for public comment at this time. Okay, all right, thank you. Next order of business is minutes. So included in our packet is the minutes from the May 13th meeting. So at this time, could I get a motion to approve the attached May 13th, 2020 minutes?
So moved. Michael.
Second.
Who was the second?
Sharon.
Thank you, Sharon. All right, discussion. All right, all in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, unanimously approved. Next order of business is correspondence. So included in our packet also was any correspondence received from 5/12 to 5/25. The item that we have here in front of us, as was included in your packet, was comments from Marcus Fairbrother. So these were, I believe, Marcus, the same comments that you actually read during public comments. So it was good for us to have these comments in writing as well for us to refer to and reflect on. So hopefully some of the questions you have here will be things that we're going to address tonight in our conversations and kind of move forward around what the pause means and answer some of those questions and just kind of have more of a dialogue around that now that we've had some time for that information to kind of absorb and we can figure out next steps from there. So that is the included correspondence for that time period. Next order of business is reports. So we have several reports tonight. I'm going to start off with this chair report that I'm hoping will, again, provide some more clarity around kind of this newest information that we've received, but we will have some additional updates from liaisons tonight. Our architect report, just as a summary, is, again, if you remember where we are in our process, we're really looking at the schematic design, that final submission of the schematic design from TSKP as kind of a conclusion of all the conversations we've had to date. So they will run through that in their architect report and then owner's rep report from there, which will lead us right into new business. But first of all, I do want to have a conversation in the chair report around a couple things. And this is in relation to public comment from last week, as well as comments that I received from community members over the past 2 weeks since we have learned of the decision to pause the building committee. And that led us to a couple things and a couple decision points, some conversation we need to have tonight to make sure everybody's clear and just making sure that we're comfortable with what the impacts of that decision are, what it means to us as a project and what it means to our project process. But I also want to discuss the fact that decisions like this in a very interesting time for all of us, which is, a very fluid environment, a lot of unknowns, I tend to talk a lot about process and, what the impact of the process is, but there's also a significant impact to people overall. And the people that really believe in this project, have worked hard on this project, have supported this project, have been engaged in this project, even the people that maybe don't support the solution that we have on the table right now, but have been engaged with us and have asked questions that have really been helpful for us as a committee, as a community to reflect on. So what I don't want to do is gloss over the importance of the impact of this type of decision to pause the project on the people in our community and the people on our committee, and really the people who have supported us all along. I think the honest thing to say here is that it's disappointing to hear this news and to know that, I think we all felt that we were really confident in the solution that we have put forward, have had really great discussions around it, and that this can, in its initial blush, look like a setback to us, but I don't want it to be thought of that way. I would really like us to look at it as certainly a challenge that we're going to need to overcome. There's impacts here that we're going to discuss that we need to address and move forward from, but this is certainly not something that's going to stop the project. And I think we have had support to date, continually from our Board of Ed, from our Town Council, who, if we remember, unanimously supported the decision and the recommendation, the conceptual option that we put on the table. And we know that by working collaboratively with the Board of Ed and with the Town Council, that we can move this project moving forward and understand impacts as we go along, as we've discussed, to make sure that we're making the best decisions at the right time, again, in a very fluid environment. So, I don't want to minimize the fact that this is a disappointing situation, and the fact that, there was a lot of work, there was a lot of excitement around, I think, this project and the progress we've made. And I don't see the decision to delay the referendum date in any way a reflection on the work we've done as a committee. And I think that's all very important to remember. So there are people that are impacted by this decision. It's not just the process. It's the committee members that have put the hard work and effort into it. It's community members that have attended hours and hours of meetings to this point, wondering what's next, what's happening, what's going on. It's students and faculty of FHS who have been engaged and listened and provided feedback. And all of those people are impacted. And I think we really do need to keep that in mind. Not to dwell on it, but just to acknowledge it and say that we understand that this is disappointing, can certainly be frustrating, the process, but it's understandable why we're in the situation we're in, and that we can really, use this information to make smart decisions moving forward. So before I move on to process, I just wanted to kind of open that up to the committee members anyway, if they wanted to reflect on that as far as how decisions like this are impacting, the people that are involved, and they're really the most important part of the process, and see if they had any other thoughts that they wanted to add. Okay. All right, so with that being said, what I wanted to do now is kind of move on to some other questions that I have received over the last few weeks, things I think that have caused some confusion. And this is going to be process driven, this conversation now, I think, because that's really where we start to get into details and understanding overall impacts. So Devin, if we could go on to the next slide. So really, these are kind of the three big items that I want to go through today at least during my chair report. We're going to do some more detailed work and conversation around kind of future planning in our new business section of the meeting tonight, but I wanted to level set this right now so that people have a good understanding of where we are, and see if I can put some clarity and context around some decision points. So really the process questions that I've received, and I think there's some confusion around each one of these bullets, is what new information was communicated by Town Council that affects the Farmington High School Building Committee timeline, and why is the new information important? How does this new information impact the FHSBC timeline, and how will the FHBC respond to these impacts? So really our job is, from a charge perspective, is to take a look at the information and decisions that are happening that impact our project and respond accordingly. And that's what I want to kind of walk through now, step by step, to make sure that everybody's on the same page around this. So we go on to the next slide, Devin. So the very first question, what new information was communicated that affects the FHSB timeline, and why is the new information important? So on May 12th, the Town Council agreed that the FHS building project would not be included on a referendum ballot prior to November 15th, 2020. The Town Council is the governing body responsible for setting the referendum date. So based on that, that is the new information that we received 2 weeks ago, is that we will not be voting on this prior to November 15th. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about why November 15th is an important date to think about in this conversation, but it's a point, a fact that is really driving the rest of this conversation. So the next statement is very important for people to understand. Although it was never officially approved by Town Council, so I just said that the Town Council is the governing body responsible for setting the referendum date. Although it was not officially approved by Town Council, the Building Committee was using a fall 2020 referendum date as a projected milestone in order to manage the project schedule. So to this point, we had been planning on a fall referendum date for the building project, and that obviously drove all our dates up until that point. But that was nothing that was confirmed by Town Council. So I want to make sure everybody's clear on that. It was a planning date that we have used, and maybe I wasn't clear enough on that as we talked through process, but that was really the facts of how this process works. So what I want to be clear in is, it's bolded there's projected milestone in order to manage the project schedule. So those two pieces of information are very important for us as we move forward in understanding the impacts to the overall timeline. Okay, Devin. So how does this impact the timeline? So this is important information, I think, to understand. So a change in a or any projected major milestone date adjusts a project timeline moving forward. So makes sense to everybody. As I said, we have always been driving towards that fall referendum date as a planned date, and had adjusted all our project deliverables up until that point. Now that that fall referendum date is off the table for right now, the project timeline obviously needs to be adjusted moving forward. So very, factual statement, it makes sense. If we move that referendum date, then we need to adjust our project timeline overall. So by removing the possibility of referendum prior to November 15th, the high school building committee must. These are two things that happen. So this is the impact of that decision to not hold a referendum prior to November 15th. But we postpone the next steps in the process until the Town Council is prepared to review the recommended schematic design and budget based on the town financial evaluation post-October. So that is what we heard, is that there's some concern overall, and we need to make sure that the Town Council is prepared to receive our recommended schematic design and budget so that they can approve that information or oppose it, depending on their conversation. If they do approve it, then they would set the referendum date from there. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we go through the actual process overall, but keep that in mind. That's really the next step in our process, was to provide that recommendation to Town Council, and that's where the pause is happening. Right there, we are pausing with completion of schematic design until Town Council is ready and prepared to review the information we have in schematic design and the budget associated to that in relation to financial evaluation. The second bullet here is we must delay the submission of the state reimbursement application until June 2021. So this is an important piece of information. It's not necessarily driving our overall project schedule, but I think it's something, because we've talked about state reimbursement and the application, and we were driving towards a submission date at the end of June, that this is really something that does change. This is significant to our timeline. So delaying the submission of the state reimbursement application until June 2021. So this comes back to that November 15th date. The vote is required prior to November 15th, 2020 to be added to the priority list in December 2020. So we basically just shifted the submission of that state application to next June because we are not voting prior to November 15th. And that is just the way the state reimbursement process is written and defined. It has nothing to do with us, and that is the state regulations and how they are and how they are put out there. All right, I'm going to stop right there for a second before we go on to slide 5. Does anybody have any questions right now? Okay. All right, I'm going to go on to slide 5 then. So how will the building community respond to these impacts? So we've discussed this already, I think, in the past meeting. We're going to discuss this, how we're going to do these things in more detail as we get into the new business section of the meeting. But we will create a new project information landing page on our building committee website, including FAQs and project information most relevant during the timeline pause. So we are going to consolidate, excuse me, all the information that we feel as a committee is relevant and should be out there for people to access. And I'm hoping at our June, in our June meeting, we can have kind of an outline of what that's going to look like so that we're very clear and everybody's comfortable on the level of information and how we're providing that on the website. It should be quick and easy for people to access. They shouldn't have to hunt for this information. Basically, at this point during the pause, this is what you need to know. This is where we are in the process. This is the pause. This is what it means. And this is what the current schematic design recommendation looks like, things like that. So we're going to talk more about that, but it is a commitment that we will make, I think, to address and respond to the impacts of the change. We will continue to meet monthly to evaluate new information as it is received. We've talked about this already, and again, in new business, we're going to talk about that meeting schedule, what it looks like, you know, how best to lay out that schedule in making sure we get the information we need when we need it. And making sure the updates are received in a timely fashion. We'll work collaboratively with the Town Council and Board of Ed to establish a new project timeline based on a projected referendum date. So again, we do need to look towards that referendum date to figure out the rest of our timeline and what that means. We will obviously be working very closely with Town Council on their level of comfort and when they will be prepared for us to provide a recommendation to them and all the pertinent information they need to evaluate and place this project on a referendum ballot moving forward. So again, constant communication is going to be part of that monthly evaluation process that we will establish moving forward. And last but certainly not least, stay connected to the farming community. So again, ways in which we can do this, we will continue to use the channels that we already have in place. We'll talk later in new business about continuation of the communications committee and what that means, and making sure we use that subcommittee to the best of our ability and making sure we're reaching out to Farmington community members and giving them the information they need. This has, I do agree, I've received feedback on this that we have not done the best job. I would say in the last month or so around this, that I think we can do a better job for the community to give them the information that they need. And make sure that everybody's up to date. Some of that is just the fluidity of our environment. Some of that is just, it's adjusting to this virtual world that we're in and what that means and when that's going to end. So I would appreciate patience as we work through this and make sure that we, you know, understand this is new for everybody, that we, you know, have committed to communication in a way that makes sense for people. I think we've done a great job to date. We just need to make some adjustments to make sure we're doing that to the best of our ability moving forward. And then the final slide. So this is something that should look very familiar to everybody. And I think hopefully will make sense to people and really kind of express what I think or what I'd like to see as a projected outlook. So again, there's a statement that you can barely read at the very bottom of this slide that talks about this being a planning document. This by no means is something that's settled in any way, but I think when we really kind of look at this project overall, the information we know right now and how we understand it, this is a reasonable expectation for us to think about as far as how this project is going to move forward. So when I'm not even going to worry about the conceptual option phase. We've talked about it many times and we've completed all our tasks around that. Preliminary plan phase we've seen where we've gone through the process, obviously, to select the project architect. That schematic design development is where we are right now. So where we were doing schematic design development, collaborating with stakeholders, and then schematic design review and analysis. So that was that iterative process where we've been talking at every meeting about what schematic design looks like, how we make changes, what the impacts of those changes are, and how that's reflected in the overall design recommendations. We are right there in the process, as you can see in that little yellow arrow. I have inserted the pause into the process. So there's where the pause is happening. This is a very natural place in the overall project timeline. Actually, the fact that we will have a delivered schematic design package from TSKP tonight leaves us in a place where we have done the work that we can do right now, knowing the information that we know. And so it leads us to that pause where you can see it fits right after the design review. And then following the pause, where we would pick right back up in the process would be schematic design and budget presented to town councils. This is where I talked about the fact that they need to be ready to receive this information and they need additional information in order to be comfortable to do that. What I would like to see, and I've got in here as projected, is a Q4 2020 perspective, a projected timeline on that. So a milestone, kind of somewhat of a stake in the ground of around the time frame of Q4 2020, we could be back at the table to have these conversations. Again, this is just projected. This based on the information we know that we're looking at a post-October conversation. This kind of makes sense overall for us to think about this as we're moving forward. The second part to that process, once we deliver the recommendation, is the step right below, which the schematic design and budget is approved by town council and a referendum date is set. So that's the important piece to this process. Again, would be happening pretty much back to back, those two steps. So again, Q4 of 2020, in order for us to, have them time to review it, ask questions, and then come back with the information that we need, which would be that referendum date to move forward. And then we have a gap in the middle there, which is continued community education and communication. So we have always said in our process that once we know the referendum date, there's work to be done to make sure that all of our community members understand the schematic design, what it means, what it looks like, and we need time to do that. So we need to build into our process that time. And we can do that once we know what a referendum date might look like and how we proceed forward from there. And then what I'd like to see from there, this again, completely projected town meeting referendum, projected second quarter of 2021. So we'd be looking maybe spring-ish of 2021, where we possibly could be looking at a referendum date in general. So again, projected, but it gives us at least something to wrap our heads around to really think about what it could look like. And I think this is something we can evaluate and review at our monthly meetings as we move forward, keep the community updated on, and understand, we will learn more as we go. We will understand overall impacts, understand all the analysis that town council needs to do in order to help us move through this process. But at least it gives us, I think, something to think about and hold on to as far as moving the project forward on a timeline that I think makes sense based on the information we know right now. All right, I'm going to stop right there and open it up for questions.
Megan, this is Michael Smith. Do we have, this too will be fluid, but is there value in having conversations with our legislative representatives in Connecticut to question whether or not the granting process of needing to be approved after June 30th, is there a chance they might do an interim process in the 2021 year, given that we are probably not the only town that may have put things on hold for reimbursement proposals to the state?
I'm going to just say a quick comment, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mark or Chris just to talk a little bit more about their interactions with the state as well as some of the conversations we've had. I think that having those conversations and keeping our representatives in the loop is certainly something I think that's of benefit to us so that they can understand the impacts and what this means. I know I did receive some communication directly on this from Mike D'Amico to say, hey, what can I just ask a few questions? And I haven't had an opportunity to connect with him yet, but I think it is a good thing for us to stay engaged around that. I think certainly something we can discuss, in our monthly meetings to say this is something, a standard conversation point we need to, revisit. I don't, Mark and Chris, do you want to discuss anything more, anything you've heard from the state or decisions around this?
Sure, this is Mark. So what we've heard from the state and what we've continued to follow along, because we have asked the questions concerning the pandemic and the time frame of things, and absolutely other municipalities sort of thinking the same thing in terms of wanting to wait or push a referendum date out. And the response that we continue to get back from the state is just that they are not planning to change the process, to have an interim process, that they expect to continue through with their they expect to continue with the way that they're going. So they're going to, they want to keep their dates. There are some towns that have already submitted their grant applications, and there are some towns that are not referendum towns. And so to pull that process back, they feel would not be fair to those towns. They did indicate that they expect to have the dollars in place for both this year and next year as part of the budget process. So there was no indication that they were concerned that those dollars were going to be allocated elsewhere. But for right now, as far as we know, that's the process. So speaking with our legislators, certainly would benefit to educate them and keep them informed as to what's going on and what's happening as an effect of that, but not sure what that would do for us at the state level.
I think, Michael, when we start our conversation around the overall calendar and what it's going to look like potentially moving forward, one of the things I want to discuss was some standing agenda items for those meetings. And I think maybe we can add something along those lines just to see if we've learned any more or if there's any more information that we need to react to or understand. Any other questions? Okay, so keep this kind of in the back of your mind at the moment as kind of a precursor for our conversations when we talk about the overall project calendar and what this could mean for us. But at this point, why don't we go ahead and move on to additional reports, if there's anything in addition for us to discuss. So Kathy, was anything else for communications at this time, or do we need to kind of wait till our next meeting?
I don't have any updates. We will just continue to meet monthly, update the website as videos are completed, and we do plan, to continue to communicate in newsletters and other ways of communicating with the community. So we'll just continue our work.
Okay. Neighborhood Communications Subcommittee, Sharon, I think you're probably in the same boat for this week, right? That we're
Yes, correct. There's been no activity since our last meeting, but we will continue to involve the neighbors in the future and having conversations with them in the planning process.
Okay. All right, next item is Board of Education Liaison Report. So Beth or Ellen, anything in addition you'd like to add at this time?
This is Beth. I can just say that Ellen's been, updating the Board of Education at our meetings. They're up to date about the pause and new scheduling. And I believe it was at our last meeting, the board approved the FHS and central office, the ed specs for those. And we also had a presentation from TSKP on the schematic design. So the board is up to speed.
All right, Chris, Town Council Liaison Report, anything in addition?
Just from sort of a purely logistical perspective, the only meeting we had was last night since our last meeting, and there was nothing substantive discussed about the high school project. It was a relatively light schedule for us. I would encourage people to take advantage of and look into what's going on at the Hillstead Museum. There's very exciting things going on there. So that was largely the substance of our meeting. This bullet point was added to the agenda today. So I'm going to make a comment, or two, but I'm speaking by, I don't have authority. I didn't talk to my other council members given the timeframes, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a council member. And Megan, I just want to echo your comments at the beginning that the council remains totally committed to this project. I personally, having been on the board for 6 years and chair for half of that, absolutely recognize the importance of this project to the community and the students and families of Farmington. And we're disappointed, we're frustrated, but we don't look at this as a setback. I just ask the community to be understanding of the very uncertain financial times we're operating in at this point. I mean, our with the deferment, tax deferment, our revenues are drying up for 90 days, and we just need to get through that to see where we stand and to assess our financial landscape, so we can make sure that this project does go through and stands the best chance of approval at referendum. So I would just ask that people understand this is a dynamic process evolving, that we be adaptive to it, and these are very challenging and uncertain times, but in no way should this pause be construed as any type of lack of commitment to this project. So I would just echo your concerns and just everybody know that.
Great, thank you, Chris. All right, before we move on to the architect report, any other questions or thoughts from the committee at this time? Okay, all right, so we are going to hand this over to Richard and Michael at this time for architect report.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Meg. Good evening, everyone. So this evening, we prepared a PowerPoint presentation that just summarizes what is in what we call the schematic design report. This report is a document that is available in PDF format. It is downloadable, printable, emailable, and it's an 8.5 by 11 format, and it contains the material that we prepared during the schematic design process, or I should say selected material that we prepared during the schematic design process. So you may recall that we prepared quite a number of PowerPoint presentations, a number of illustrations, photographs of existing conditions, code analysis, an investigation of the existing facility, a lot of material. We looked at various options during the competition phase, and then during the schematic design phase, we finalized the plans, and with the exception of the site plan, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So this report, which is in 8.5 by 11 format, we prepared this because we thought it was important to hand over to the building committee a document that summarizes the schematic design. And it contains several sections, 7 sections plus appendices. and I'm going to have Michael take us through that briefly. But I will tell you that this is just a summary. If we were to compile all of the information, there would be probably binders full of material, and that's not particularly useful when you want to distribute that to your constituency. I imagine you may want to have copies of this report available just as soon as you can open up your facilities. I imagine that your library, your public library, is not operating at full speed at the moment. I know a lot of town libraries are not, but at some point in the near future, you may want to have such material available for the public to see. I know you're reformatting your landing page for your website, so you might want to have a link to this summary report to allow members of the public to study it. And if you look at this cover, and I don't know if you've seen this yet, I know it was there was a link sent to members of the committee, but if you look at this cover, you can see that on the bottom it says draft 27th May 2020. That's today. And we called it a draft because we're looking for your help in finalizing this. It may stay draft for quite some time, but maybe not. So I would like to ask committee members to review this document, get feedback back to us, either through the chair or through CSG, and we can make one final round of edits and bring that to the committee at its next, perhaps as soon as the next meeting. So with that, what I would like to do is ask Michael to give you the highlights of this schematic design report. Michael?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thanks, everyone. So as Richard mentioned, the report, that's the cover of it, is broken into...
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm not sure how other people are hearing you, but your audio connection is not good.
Can people hear me better now?
No.
How about now? How is the audio connection?
Perfect.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that, but the schematic design report is broken up into these 7 parts: an acknowledgement, an introduction and guiding principles, a discussion of the site design, and then the building layout with regards to educational specifications. There's a section about the learning communities, which mirroring the ed spec, we tried to zero in on the pods and the opportunities presented there. And then a pretty good summary of the cost estimate that we presented in our last meeting, as well as an overview of those alternates that we had identified. And lastly, a conclusion. To Richard's point, there are books and books of material that the building committee has assembled throughout the life of this project. Great deal of that was passed on to us during part 1 of this phase, when we were in competition and working on 3 schemes simultaneously. This report really attempts to summarize rather than capture everything, and it specifically is focused in on part 2 of your town council charge. So it really picks up from option 3, TSKP's team being selected at the end of January, and everything we've done moving forward. To the extent that it references previous schemes, it does that only so that the information is material to part 2's development and the finalization of the schematic design. Looking at the report, the introduction and guiding principle does reference the initial charge of the building committee and talks about the most cogent pieces that emerged from the Part 1 selection process that were brought forward into Part 2. The site design, as I mentioned before, really breaks down how we came to the layout with the building committee and the decision points that we made. It talks a lot about the positioning of the building along the eastern edge rather than the football field, and the other associated improvements that this project will bring to the campus. The building layout really talks about the building as a large diagram and how it's organized from the entrances and across those two main internal axes. And it talks a little bit about how the ed spec is distributed across that diagram for best use and adjacencies. And then the cost and alternates summarizes from the presentation made to the town of the option 3 that was recommended by the building committee moving forward, and how we got to our current piece and the current cost estimate that we presented at the previous meeting. This section does end with a paragraph on each of these ad alternates, and ends with TSKP's current recommendation about what how that alternate should progress into the next phase. And you'd certainly welcome the committee's comment and wisdom on those items in particular. So that summary is a little under 40 pages, and it tries to move briskly with lots of pictures so that it's easily understood. The rest of the report is lengthy, but it's the key exhibits that have been developed, again, primarily since January. Those are all of the renderings, all of the views that we've developed along the way, and we tried to reflect in those views the most current version of those views rather than showing all the options along the way. We tried to capture how it would be if we proceeded right into construction with the schematic design. Here are two of those renderings, but you'll see that there are many in the appendix. The illustrative plans, which are always helpful, I think, particularly for quick discussion points. And these, again, rather than show all the planned developments, we simply showed the final version of the plans as they exist now in the schematic design. There's a rather lengthy set of technical drawings from all of the disciplines. These were the documents that were prepared at the beginning of April and became the core of the cost estimate. There's good engineering and technical information. They are not as digestible as the renderings or the illustrative plans. There's about an 80-page pricing narrative of each of the core pieces of the proposed building. And again, these were developed in the middle of April to go to our cost estimator and help give a level of quality that we aspire to the quantities depicted in the drawings. And then lastly, there's the cost estimate in full. I think with you all, we reviewed essentially the 30,000 foot cost summary of the construction costs, but this is the detailed takeoffs that were developed and then rolled into the numbers that we presented to you at the previous building committee. So all told, it's a fairly large document, but hopefully it's organized so that you can find what you're interested in, and you can also quickly get a pretty good overview and understanding of the project. I'm going to move on. The second part of the presentation is about the site plan, and we'll use the illustrative site plan that we presented. It should look familiar. This has been updated for what we believe is the baseline scheme for the schematic design. And it includes all of the elements on the east side of the property that you'll recognize, as well as a renovated 1928 building, a new practice baseball field that has been relocated from this corner, new tennis courts, 8 of them, that have been relocated from here, nothing down at the library lawn, and a pretty good parking lot that has been delineated since conceptual design. Most of the parking was located here, and it's been shifted here. So that's the site plan that we presented to you in previously, and we described how the softball field competes for real estate on this upper hill. And if the goal is to bring everything up to this campus and not utilize the other areas, that things get pretty congested, and you would have to do some significant site work in order to create sufficient flat spaces along this berm and this berm for all the program elements. We also, you'll recall, in tracking the alternates, discussed that the softball field could be removed as an alternate and no longer tracked. And we also discussed the future of the 1928 building may be brought forward as a line item referendum. And so it could be demolished, it could be mothballed, or it could be restored, depending on the recommendation of this committee, the endorsement of town council, and the aggregate votes of your public. Nevertheless, it was requested that we look at perhaps a slightly different scenario that would maintain the softball field and perhaps remove the 1928 building. And that scheme is reflected here. And you can see that all of the tennis courts are lined up along the 1928 building pad here on the edge before it descends down onto the lower library lawn. This is the softball practice field. This is the relocated baseball field. And you can also see that we've had to cut back, I will say 60 parking spaces from this area. So this scheme operates at about the same parking capacity as you currently have on site. And we could, with the benefit of time, continue to improve that, or we could optimize it for parking and reducing cut into this hillside. There's some balancing acts that we could do. This said, I don't think we believe this is a bad site plan. I think uniformly in the office we prefer the first site plan, but we felt it important to report to you what some of your choices could be along the way. So I think that's the extent of the presentation, and I will gladly take questions or comments Richard and I can maybe elaborate on anything that I may have skipped over too quickly.
Just before we move on to questions, if there are any couple things, Richard, you did mention about us, this will certainly be part of that new landing page, is any presentation that you provide to us will go up there for access and full access for the community to read and review. And as the building committee, we've been asked to kind of review this, come back with any final questions, comments, concerns. If anybody in the building committee feels that a printed version of any of this is something that would benefit them, if they could just let me know and I can see if I can coordinate that to try to make that happen. Maybe we get something mailed out or something along those lines. So just as a side note, there's a lot of information here, and if that's something that's going to make sense, you can just let me know and I can handle the coordination of that.
Again, this is Michael Smith. I have a question for Richard and Michael. First, I'd say I appreciate all the detail and putting all this in one space. I think in seeing that, there was something that caught my attention. I was hoping you might be able to review it with us. It's punctuated, I think, in the renderings of how one enters the building along that Main Street. And in the first set of 3-story stacked learning areas, the area to the right, which are the classrooms, are all, you see this in the schematic technical drawings, and you see it also in the renderings, that it appears as though those classrooms are all glass on the interior, and that the classrooms that we added on the left hand, or the mirroring the opposite side of the Main Street there, hallway, are also glass. And yet, when you move down to the second block of stacked classrooms, they're all solid surfaces as you traverse the Main Street area, and you have the classrooms on your right or your left. And I'm wondering if you can share why the differentiation of having a solid wall versus an entirely glass wall, and what perhaps what's motivating the differentiation of those spaces. I think you see it there's a picture on page 7 of your presentation right here. Yeah, right back there. You see while those students are all looking up at something, you see behind them, I think there's 3 classrooms along that wall that all have glass top to bottom walls.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think if I'm reading the schematic or technical drawings right, that's replicated on the other side of the opposite side of the hallway as well. I think there's 3 classrooms that we added there.
Right.
And yet when you walk all the way down that hall, the surface area becomes a solid wall for the next block of classrooms. I hope I'm making sense as I'm verbalizing.
No, I think you're doing a really good job describing what you're seeing in the drawings, and this is such a good summary. I don't have access to the drawings to show the committee exactly what you're seeing, but I will acknowledge that the classrooms in general, let's just take a generic classroom in a learning community, was priced with a fixed amount of glazing side light that looked out into the breakout area or into the hallway, so that was engaged in the life of the school. And that amount, I seem to remember, it was 12 linear feet of floor-to-ceiling glass alongside the door. And that's just a generic pricing element that was, you'll see it in the cost estimate, gets repeated as a linear footage. This area specifically at the entrance, Michael, you'll recall some discussions with the working group of what happens when we don't necessarily distribute the special ed classrooms uniformly throughout the entire learning communities, and instead we take an element called the SLC and we put it into one of the learning communities, and how does that shift the classrooms within that learning community to incorporate that program element. So at the entrance, we are trying to do two things. We're trying to create a sense of entry, as well as pull those classrooms into the life of the learning community that's to the left or to the right of that view, and some general use classrooms and perhaps touchdown space for visitors that are on the left-hand side of that view at the first floor. So there's some additional articulation that we are tracking as a pricing element right now. Will the glass look exactly like that? I think that's for the next phase to delineate in more detail, but it protects a design intent and a cost and gives us something to work with as we develop it. It could be less glass, it could be opalescent glass, it could be some combination. I think the other part of your question is why those classrooms and not the others? And I think we would just have to balance that with the faculty and the working group as to how much glass uniformly do you want in the classrooms, or do you want to generate a range of classroom environments as well?
So let me just add here, I think, Michael Smith, you're studying these drawings very well, which is impressive. I think one of the issues here is that when we start generating material for the building committee's reviews, we'll generate a perspective, we'll generate floor plans, and sometimes these get a little out of sync. This illustration, this perspective view, was generated fairly early in the design process, and then the floor plans were developed a little bit later. Now, we did not go back and update every view, so maybe that's one of the problems here. I think our Michael is correct when he is saying that what we did is give you a sense of what this atrium space would look like, and then we wanted to make sure that we explained to our cost estimate a range of possibilities to make sure that the cost estimate was correct. But perhaps by adding some additional language here in the caption below this illustration to explain that this glass may not extend as much as is illustrated in this particular view. But it's a good catch. I think it's a good point.
Yeah, and the part of the reason why I bring it up is I would think Scott and Kathy, it would be valuable to engage faculty around this issue, because I mean, there's certainly unique design elements to it, there's cost elements to it, but I think there's also just a what does it do to learning? And it looks like it repeats itself to a perhaps lesser degree, and I think it's a little bit of the function of how closely I can examine maybe the second floor, but it looks like it repeats itself on your drawings on the second floor on both sides of that area there. And so I just invite potentially some curiosity among the faculty around the advantages and disadvantages of that floor to ceiling glass. And then, you know, there's certainly as you both pointed out, a cost component of this work here. But I'd be curious about whether or not the faculty picked up on that and had a sense of or just how they responded to the possibility of having a space like that, because it's intriguing, and yet it really is also glass right along the a large thoroughfare of activity. And so I can see advantages and disadvantages to it, but I was wondering if maybe Scott or Kathy, you picked up any feedback from faculty about how receptive they would be to using classrooms like that.
Sure, Michael. I can jump in briefly. To date, we've, prior to being on this time away, we spent time monthly at our faculty meetings reviewing the building committee and the progress. We were also fortunate to have Michael and Richard come and present at the time some of these design elements as well, along with meeting with our department leaders a couple times as well, along with Mark and Chris as well. I would say overall the feedback was immensely positive. We also surveyed them. I don't know that we specifically highlighted those elements that you're discussing now, but I would expect as we continue to progress and once we get back in the fall, we'll continue to take a look at this, and I can certainly seek some more specific feedback regarding that point as well.
Is this an element that you had explored and used in Guilford, that glazing, the glass that's ceiling to floor?
Yes, we have. However, we haven't used it in classrooms. We did not use it in Guilford classrooms. We did use it in guidance areas, the school administration area, and it was a technique we used to get daylight into those spaces. This atrium, or this main hallway, is filled with natural light, and so
Gotcha.
to have that light brought into those kinds of spaces. But when it comes to classrooms, it is something that needs to be reviewed carefully with the educators. I mean, I suspect, Scott, when we were meeting with faculty, no one looked at this particular picture and said, wait a minute, is that my classroom? They may have imagined it was a lecture hall perhaps, or something. I'm not sure what they thought. But Michael Smith spent time comparing this illustration with the actual floor plans, and he picked up on a very good question that educators would probably want to discuss further with you and with us. It may not make sense to have full glass in the classrooms. It depends upon the particular classrooms. So I would agree with Scott that I think this needs to be fleshed out a little bit more with the educators. And if they say, okay, classrooms with all glass make a lot of sense to show education or learning on display for visitors to the school, then great. But if not, then we can certainly modify this illustration or add some notations to the caption to make sure that this is just something that is being further discussed with faculty.
And Richard, I like your thought process in terms of how you in that part of the building where you don't have an exterior connection, how you're drawing the light from above. I wonder, are there some compromises as faculty may navigate how that will work? And the reason I also just bring it up, and I could be wrong in just my sort of takeoffs of this, there may be as many as 8 or 9 classrooms that are like this, and so I think for that reason it's worth drawing some specific attention to it. And if there are spaces that that you've designed or that are designed perhaps for a different purpose, for others to visit those and to really kind of get a grasp of how that would impact the classroom or learning, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, we can certainly do that.
So I have one other question as well. I'm trying to recall if it showed up on one of the, it is on one of the, it's on one of the exterior elevations in the renderings, and it's also in the drawings. Is it ventilation space that sits in front of the weight room, the gymnasium, and the music spaces? Yes, those boxes there. Or is that an aesthetic thing? What are those three on each side?
Those are high clear story windows because in this instance you have the large music room beyond, and in this instance you have the small music room beyond, and here's the weight room. And then as we developed these, we added essentially a blinder on it to help cut the extreme western sun that you might get at sunset, loading that space with heat. So there's just a little collar on these just to take the curse off of it.
Okay.
Yeah, those are not ventilation units. Those are a way to get daylight higher into the room.
Great, thank you.
If you think of other questions, Michael, just forward them. This is what we want to hear. We want to hear these kinds of comments from the committee, because if you have these kinds of questions, I suspect over the course of the next few months, as people see this schematic report, they're going to have similar kinds of questions.
Any other questions or thoughts at this time for Michael or Richard? Okay, it sounds like then obviously this is information that's going to be available to the public, as well as the committee members have access to all this documentation. There's a lot of detail here to review beyond the overview that we just received. So between now and our next building committee meeting, I ask the building committee take some time to review that documentation. It sounds like, Richard, you're okay with kind of questions going directly to you in the meantime?
Yes, we'll keep a record of that and share not only the questions, but our responses or edits to the document.
Excellent. And then we'll also obviously have this as an agenda item in our June meeting to review those and address questions, concerns, and have continued conversation now that we've seen all information in one place as kind of an overall look at the project as it exists right now.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael and Richard. We appreciate the update. Next and final report is owner's rep report. So Mark, anything you want to share right now prior to our new business conversation?
No, I don't think so. I think other than just discussing the calendar.
Okay.
And we can certainly roll in some of the comments from your beginning presentation as we move forward.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So just one last opportunity for committee chairs before we move off reports and move on to new business. Any other questions, comments on updates, or anything we've learned so far this evening? All right, so we will move right on to the new business portion of the meeting. The very first item that we have here is to approve the revised 2020 FHS Building Committee meeting schedule. So the very first thing I'm going to do before we start discussion is ask for a motion to approve the revised 2020 FHS Building Committee meeting schedule.
So move. This is Sharon.
Second, John Carrier.
All right, and then I'm going to open it up for discussion. So Mark, if you could take it from here.
Sure. So as you're looking at your screen, you'll see that we've revised the calendar to go from May through to the end of the year. What we did was we basically focused on the town council meetings and wanted to follow along, having our building committee meetings follow those town council meetings, and so that we could take whatever we learned from that town council meeting and have something to discuss for an agenda item on our building committee meetings. And then we followed the building committee meetings with any communication committee meetings. So if that committee needed to convene to talk about how we were going to communicate whatever messages we came up with at the building committee, or what we felt was important to get out into the public, that we would have that time slot on everybody's calendar moving forward. So the idea here is after tonight's meeting, that the next meeting would be in June. So town council meeting on the 9th, a building committee meeting on the 10th, and again, a communications meeting on the 11th. As you follow down month by month, in July, excuse me, July and August, there's one town council meeting in each one of those months, and we were planning to have one building committee meeting and one communications meeting. And then on the calendar, following through, as you scroll down a little, Devin, I don't know if you can scroll that calendar a little bit, thank you, that in September, there are 2 town council meetings currently scheduled. We will have the building committee meeting after the first town council meeting, and a communications meeting there to follow. The next one in October, and then again in November and in December. We felt that it made sense to roll this out to the end of the year. If we were following along our original schedule, right about now would be the time when we were presenting budgets to schematic design and our budgets and alternates to town council for approval, and expectations of that referendum date. We would be working diligently to get through that application period, which is June 30th. Right now, as you heard me speak, there's no intention from the state to change that schedule. So our next available opportunity to apply to the state would be again for that next June 30th deadline. However, we can hold a referendum before that application. So if we hold a referendum, get approval from the town, we just include that in our application as we move forward. And the town could potentially make a decision to invest in creating the construction documents, bringing the CM on board, those kinds of things before the application is technically approved and slated in that December timeframe. So looking ahead, we would want to be prepared, as Meg had stated in her initial report, to be hopeful for some information in that last quarter of 2020. So October, November, December, if we've got some real information to work with, that's when we're going to pick this back up, regroup, identify a presentation to town council, and hope for a new scheduled referendum date. And then that's when we would pick back up with all the communications. And that usually that 90-day window that we'd like to have from the time that we select that referendum date to the actual holding of that referendum. In Megan's example, second quarter of 2020, would put you into that April, May, June time slot. So I think that there's a lot for us to think about and a lot for us to talk about moving forward. We'd like to consider possibly having some standard agenda items for the building committee so that we could identify whether or not anything that came out of town council or information moving forward, if it in fact made sense. Because if there were no updates, it may not make sense to hold that meeting that month. But my feeling is we'll have a lot to consider and discuss in the months ahead. Really, that's all I had. We did put some of the holidays, the observed holidays on the calendar. It's an open slate right now. I think it gives us opportunities to plug in, but we wanted to have a revised meeting schedule that everybody could follow and keep on their calendars to the end of the year. I think that was it. Meg, anything that I missed?
I don't think so. I'd just be looking for committee members, couple thoughts. I mean, I obviously in the original, as Mark just kind of reiterated, threw out some thoughts on a potential projected timeline for us based on the information we know right now. Just wanted to get people's thoughts on that. You know, that's just what I was thinking based on what we know, but I'm more than willing to hear people's thoughts at this time on that, as well as kind of the meeting cadence we have here as a recommendation. And if that makes sense to everybody, I think we can get the meeting schedule approved. And then I want to, again, have that conversation on some standard agenda items just to make sure that we're covering all the kind of inputs that we need in order to make decisions moving forward. So first of all, thoughts on the kind of projected timeline based on what we know and kind of the meeting cadence we have scheduled here.
Hey, Megan, this is Ellen.
Yes.
I think it's meeting after the council meetings. I think it's brilliant, by the way. I just want to bring to the committee's attention, and maybe Chris has a thought on this, but a lot of times in the summer months, the council meetings, they're on the calendar, but they have a tendency to be canceled. So just something to watch for scheduled after a council meeting that's canceled. Maybe we, think about meeting or just to watch for that.
Okay.
This summer could look totally different.
I know.
But I know we see it a lot in July and August. They tend to get canceled.
And it could be, Ellen, I think Mark had the thought there that if we have some standard agenda items, we can do kind of a review and say, do we have updates? So even though that might get canceled, do we have other items that we want to discuss to make sure that we're using time effectively and using committee members' times and committee members' times effectively. So I think something to definitely consider as we move forward.
Right, just something to watch for.
Yep, thank you. Any other thoughts? A conversation around that piece at least. Okay. What I'd like to do actually before we go to vote, since we are in discussion around this, is have a conversation around those agenda items. So let me first list off what I have heard people talk about or discuss, or some items that I think I have heard committee members mention is of importance for us to consider as standard agenda items for these monthly checkpoints for us. So I think what I've heard is obviously a town council liaison update. And so this would be an opportunity for us to hear updates from town council. Obviously, if the meeting was held before, any other information we might receive there. Board of Ed liaison update, making sure we're staying in coordination and working collaboratively with both town council and BOE, as we mentioned previously. I have heard we obviously need a communications subcommittee report as a standard agenda item, since we will continue to meet. So I think that's an important part of our agenda. A couple other things that I've heard about. So I've heard about discussions that kind of, I'd like some feedback on this one, kind of industry updates. So anything that we might be hearing around trends in, I know Richard has talked to us a little bit about some things and decisions and kind of some larger issues that construction is up against schools construction specifically. So maybe we have an opening there for us to receive information that might be pertinent or important to us. In that update, potentially adding update on any kind of legislative or state changes. It could be nothing, but it also could be something or new information that we need to provide and evaluate. And I think all that would lead us to an evaluation of our current timeline and any potential impacts. So taking all those inputs together, seeing if we know anything more, anything else that might help us drive towards a better understanding of overall project timeline and what that would mean to us and how we might adjust. So those are the things I've heard so far, but I'm certainly open to recommendations or anything else or something that I might be missing that we need to make sure we include. Okay. All right. So based on that, I'm going to assume at this time that the meeting schedule that we have here in front of us makes sense on a monthly basis, and the cadence in which we have recommended here, as well as these recommended agenda items. Certainly does not mean that we can't add anything additional as we go along, but I think it's important for us to have a plan on what we need to discuss and at least bring up at these meetings to make sure that we're evaluating all information that is important to us. So again, certainly this is not the be all and end all for our agenda items moving forward. If there's something in addition we need to add, we will certainly do so, but I think these make sense for standard agenda items moving forward. So if we have no further discussion on that, I'm going to ask for a vote then on the meeting schedule and the proposed agenda items as standard items for the meetings moving forward. We're all unmuted.
I'll make a motion that we accept the calendar as Mark presented, as well as the agenda items that were discussed. This is Sharon.
If I could just get a second on Sharon's.
Second.
John Carrier.
Excellent. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, all right, unanimously approved for both the meeting schedule as published here and the proposed agenda items moving forward. Okay, and now second piece of new business is to approve the attached invoice from CSG in the amount of $10,569. So this is for services rendered to date from CSG. The invoice is there for review at this time.
Move to approve the invoice.
Okay,
John
John.
Carrier.
This is Ellen, second.
Okay, discussion. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, all opposed? All right, unanimously approved. Okay, that is the last item on our agenda for this evening. So I think as a building committee, we have some work to do prior to our next meeting for review. And again, I just want to if anyone in the building committee is interested in having printed copies of any of the documentation, please let me know, and we'll see if we can coordinate that for you. Sometimes it's when we have this level of information. So, all right, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and ask for a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
John
Second.
Carrier.
Okay, any discussion? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed? All right, adjourned at 7:55.